From 2008 to 2011, he was a research assistant and teaching fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, as well as a research fellow at Clare Hall in Cambridge from 2009 to 2011. After moving back to Canada in 2011, he was a Keelam postdoctoral fellow in the Religious Studies program. Since 2012, Dr. Dickens had been teaching in the Department of History and Classics and the Religious Studies program at the University of Alberta. In 2021, Dr. Dickens became a visiting researcher at the University of Groningen in Netherlands. Dr. Dickens' research is concerned with connections between Syriac Christianity and Central Asia in late antiquity and the Middle Ages. He has co-authored a catalogue of Syriac manuscripts from the Berlin Turfan collection and has spoken on or published articles about the history of the Church of the East in Central Asia. The portrayal of Turks and other Eurasian steppe nomads in Syriac literature and Christian texts and inscriptions from Central Asia, including manuscript fragments from Turfan in Chinese Turkestan, gravestones discovered in Kyrgyzstan and Syriac cliff inscriptions in Uzbekistan. At this time, it's an honor to present to you Dr. Mark Dickens to present his presentation titled Missional Patriarch of the Missional Church, Part 1. Welcome, Dr. Mark Dickens.
Greetings and thank you to His Holiness Mar Awa, His Grace Mar Paulus, and Core Bishop Father George Thoma for the invitation to speak at this symposium. So when my friend and colleague David Wilmshurst in Hong Kong wrote his History of the Church of the East, he called it the Martyred Church. Although it's certainly true that your church has experienced more than its fair share of persecution, suffering, and martyrdom, there is so much more to the history of the Church of the East than that. I want to talk today about another word beginning with M, which I think describes your church equally as well as martyred, namely the word missional. But let me define my terms before going any further. Missional, of course, is an adjective, meaning simply of or relating to mission. The noun mission can be defined as the vocation or calling of a religious organization, especially a Christian one, to go out into the world and spread its faith. By the way, our English word mission comes from the Latin verb mittere, meaning to send. So those who are on a mission are those who have been sent, recalling the post-resurrection words of Jesus in John 20:21, "Peace be with you, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you." A missional church, then, is one that has been sent into the world by the risen Messiah to spread the gospel, the good news of the kingdom of God. Now, what, you may ask, did that have to do with Timothy the First? But of course, if you've been listening to the talks already, you'll have a good idea of where we're going with this talk. On that note, let's travel back to the late 8th century, to the world Timothy lived in when he found himself leading the Church of the East, beginning in the year 780. As a historian, it's always important to know where I get my information from, so I'd like to briefly introduce the primary sources I'll refer to today. All these were written by authors from the Church of the East, with the exception of the last. So the first one is what we often refer to as the Synodicon Orientale, which is just the Latin name for a Syriac work, which is a collection of synod records from the Church of the East, starting with the Synod of Isaac in 410 and ending with the Synod of Hananashil II in 775. We're also going to talk about the Book of Chastity, the English name for a Syriac work with a very long title, composed around 849 or 850 by Ishodana of Basra, the Metropolitan of Perath Mashan. You've already heard references to the third work I'll be using, the Book of Governors, which is a monastic history in Syriac by Thomas of Marga, the Bishop of Marga, probably written somewhere around the year 850. Another important source is Elia Jauhari, also known as Elia of Damascus, who was the metropolitan of that city. He produced a list in Arabic sometime after the year 903 of metropolitans in the Church of the East, which I'll be referring to. Another important Christian Arabic source is the Chronicle of Sert, probably written in the 10th century. And yet another important Arab Christian Arabic work is the Fiqh al-Nasraniya, the Law of Christianity, by Ibn at-Tayyib, who served two patriarchs in the 11th century as secretary. Whoops. Yet another important Christian Arabic work is the Kitab al-Majdal, the Book of the Tower, written by Amr ibn Mata and then continued by Mari ibn Sulaiman in the 11th and 12th centuries. I'll also make reference to what we call the Nomocanon, again the Latin term for a Syriac work compiled by Abdishol bar Baricha in the year 1290. And again, it's a compilation of canons from previous synods of the Church of the East. Abdishol bar Baricha also wrote the Order of Ecclesiastical Judgments, published, he wrote that a little bit later in the year 1315 or 1316. I'll also be referring to the Liber Patrum, which is the Latin name, again, for an anonymous Syriac work written in the late 13th or early 14th century. Yet another Christian Arabic work is that by Salibah ibn Yohanna, the Asfar al-Asrar, Books of the Secrets, written in 1332. And here we have our one very important representative from the Syrian Orthodox tradition, the writer Bar Ebroio, also called Bar Hebraeus, who wrote both a civil chronicle and an ecclesiastical chronicle, both completed in 1286, the year of his death. So let's talk a little bit about the world of Timothy. By the way, I'll be using the English version of his name. Of course, he would have referred to himself as Timotheus. He lived in a very different world than the one that we live in, one which contained a number of superpowers. The most important of these, and we've already had references to this, for Timothy and many members of the Church of the East was, of course, the Abbasid Caliphate, established in 750 and continuing on until 1258 when it was overthrown by the Mongols. At its height in the 9th century, and you can see an image of it, a map there, it stretched from modern Tunisia in the west to the region known as Mawara al-Nahr in the east. That would be modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and then from Yemen in the south up to the Caucasus in the north. And from their new capital in Baghdad, established in 763, the Abbasid rulers spread not only the religion of Islam throughout their domain, but also a cultural movement which is now known as the Islamic or the Muslim Golden Age. The Abbasids were great patrons of learning, and under their leadership, some of the greatest philosophers, mathematicians, physicists, astronomers, chemists, historians, and other scholars of the pre-modern world flourished. To the west of the Abbasid Caliphate lay the Byzantine Empire, or the East Roman Empire as its inhabitants referred to it, with its headquarters in Byzantium, also known as Constantinople. This empire had shrunk considerably since the glory days of Emperor Constantine I, who established Constantinople as the capital back in 330. By the time that Timothy was elected patriarch, the East Roman territory was limited to about 2/3 of what is now Turkey, along with what is now Greece, most of what is now Greece, and a few other smaller territories like Sicily and Sardinia. The East Roman Empire, of course, was Christian, following the Eastern Orthodox form of the faith that is still practiced in much of Eastern Europe. Now, there was a long history of the Byzantine Orthodox Church being in conflict with other Eastern churches, whether Syriac-speaking, Armenian-speaking, Coptic-speaking, or otherwise. For the Church of the East, the main point of friction with the Imperial Byzantine Church was, of course, the role and teaching of Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, from 428 to 431. But also, later on, the Orthodox Church in Byzantium got upset about the teachings of Nestorius' mentor, the famous theologian Theodore of Mopsuestia, who died the year that Nestorius became patriarch in 428. In the wake of Nestorius' condemnation at the Council of Ephesus in 431, his teachings were declared heretical by the Byzantines, and many of his followers fled to the Persian Sasanian Empire, where they were welcomed by the Church of the East, which had already declared its autonomy from the Imperial Byzantine Church in 424. And as many of you will be familiar with, in 484 and 486, in two separate synods of the Church of the East, the Diophysite theology of Theodore of Mopsuestia was officially adopted as the basis in many ways of the theology of the Church of the East. He is still, as again many of you will be aware, referred to as the interpreter, just the interpreter, because there's no one else who can compare with him in his ability to interpret the Holy Scriptures. But nonetheless, ever since that time, the Orthodox Church, the state church of the Byzantine Empire, had been antagonistic towards the Church of the East, which it considered heretical. We must also mention here a new empire on the scene, which had little, if any, relevance to Timothy or the Church of the East, but was nevertheless of growing importance. The Carolingian Empire, named after Charlemagne, who was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in the year 800. But we'll have little to say about them because, again, there was really no interaction with the Church of the East. Far to the east was another great power of the time, China under the Tang Dynasty, which at its height extended from northern Vietnam in the south to Korea in the north, from the China Sea in the east to Central Asia in the west, as you can see in the map there. Although Tang China was in frequent conflict with some of its neighbors, about which we'll speak momentarily, it nonetheless has a reputation of having been very open to foreign influence in such things as dress, cuisine, music, dance, and even religion. This openness was primarily thanks to the trade network we now call the Silk Road, which stretches westward from China through Central Asia to the territory of the Abbasids and the Byzantines at that time. China was a religiously pluralistic society under the Tang, containing not only Buddhists and Taoists, but also Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, and, as we shall see, Christians. Rounding out the political map of the time, in the 8th and 9th centuries, were two states adjacent to China, about which we'll hear more later on, especially the first, the Tibetan Empire to the south, and the Turkic Uyghur Empire, or Khaganate, to the north. The Tibetan Empire was majoritively Buddhist. The Uyghur Empire had adopted Manichaeism, which was a form of Gnosticism, as its state religion. So this was the broader world in which Timothy lived, a world that he would have been well informed about, living as he did in Baghdad, one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the time. Now, talking about general importance of Timothy, we've already heard quite a bit about that from previous remarks, so I'll be brief in my general comments here. Timothy accomplished a lot in, now it says 43 years, I have to correct that because of course, as been pointed out, it's 42 years and 8 months. Nearly 43 years that he was on the throne. He accomplished an awful lot. By the way, that was the longest reign of a patriarch up to that point, and it was not to be exceeded until the 14th century with Den-Ha II. The entry on Timothy in the Gorgias Encyclopedic Dictionary of the Syriac Heritage notes several broad areas of concern for Timothy during his long reign. The first concern was to, quote, improve the moral and educational level of both clergy and laity, end quote. A goal he pursued through encouraging scholarship, including the translation movement, which was concerned with translating Greek philosophical works and scientific works into Syriac and Arabic, and writing extensively himself, as we've already heard from other speakers. So Timothy was highly educated in both theology and philosophy, and thus he was very well equipped to lead the church at that time, located as he was in the intellectual hub of the Abbasid Caliphate. Timothy's second concern, and we've heard some references to this as well, was to establish the juridical, structures of the East Syriac Church. Among other things, he oversaw the compilation of the collection of synod records now called the Synodicon Orientale, which I've referred to earlier. Thirdly, and again we've had references to this, he put great effort into promoting understanding and dialogue between Christians and Muslims, and perhaps most famously in his disputation with the Caliph al-Mahdi, and again there have already been references to this famous debate that he had with the Caliph. And finally, and this is where we get to the main point of my talk, Timothy was concerned with the organization and spread of Christianity in Asia and the Middle East. The same entry on Timothy in the Gorgias Encyclopedic Dictionary that I referred to before says the following, quote, while Christians had been establishing communities along the trade routes of Asia for centuries, Timothy provided structure and intellectual renewal for the ongoing traditions, end quote. In other words, he ensured that what had evolved over much time was organized in such a way that it would endure in the long run. He was a great organizer. So it seems appropriate here to take a look at the overall extent of the Church of the East during Timothy's patriarchate. I'm grateful for the helpful overview that David Wilmshurst's book, The Martyred Church, gives on this. And I'd like to begin with a quote from that book, which helps to set the scene for the survey of ecclesiastical provinces we're about to embark on. By the way, I should just note that I will be using the word province, by which I mean what you would call in Syriac huparchia, from the Greek word eparchia. As Wilmshurst notes, at the synod held in 790 or 791, Timothy, quote, created a two-tier system of metropolitan provinces, distinguishing sharply between the interior provinces of Mesopotamia and the exterior provinces of the mission field. This major reform gave the metropolitans of the exterior provinces more authority in certain areas, but they were henceforth excluded from the patriarchal elections, end quote. We'll discuss these exterior provinces further below. Based on Eliot Jauhari's list of metropolitan provinces in the Church of the East, Wilmshurst gives the following 6 interior provinces. Elam, also called Beth Huzziah, Nisibis, Maishan, or Perath Maishan, with its capital in Basra, Mosul and Erbil, also known as Adiabene, Beth Garmai, and Holwan, also called Media. This list does not include what we may call the patriarchal province of Seleucia Ctesiphon, those dioceses which were under the direct influence, or rather oversight, of the patriarch. So these 6 provinces, along with the patriarchal provinces, comprise the heart of the Church of the East in Timothy's time, and in many ways their territory is analogous with the heartland of the Church to this day. Although many church members at the time who lived in this heartline, which we may broadly refer to, I suppose, as Mesopotamia, no doubt spoke Arabic or perhaps Persian in their interactions with non-Christians. Their native tongue, as well as the language of their liturgy, of course, was Syriac or Aramaic, as we might also call it. Here's a map just showing you some of the interior provinces as well as a few of the exterior ones, just to give you a sense. Of course, many of you are so familiar with this area that you don't need to see a map of it. It's when we consider the exterior provinces, however, that we start to appreciate the geographical, cultural, and linguistic diversity of the church, and it's spread into areas where it would be much more uncommon, if not impossible, to find native speakers of Syriac. Perhaps the closest of the exterior provinces, and one that had a long history in the Church of the East, we've already heard some references to it, was Fars, a prominent cultural center for Persian speakers. Its metropolitan was located in Revardashar, which was the capital of the old Sasanian province of Fars. Before the advent of Islam in the 7th century, the province of Fars had extended westward across the Persian Gulf, or the Arabian Gulf as it's called by some, to include Beth Katraya, the modern-day territory of Qatar, Bahrain, the northern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and various islands in the Gulf. Indeed, a number of churches and monasteries from this region have been excavated by archaeologists, including Sirbani Yas Island in Abu Dhabi, El Qusur on Failaka Island in Kuwait, and Kharg Island in Iran. However, by the time of Timothy, Christianity had declined significantly in the area, and the metropolitan province of Fars had lost most, if not all, of the dioceses that were located in Beth Katraya. One island that remained under the province of Fars during Timothy's patriarchate, however, was Socotra, just off the Horn of Africa, now part of the Republic of Yemen. And by things that I've seen on the internet, it looks like a beautiful place. Another important metropolitan province in what we now think of as Iran was Beth Razakaya, also called Rai, located in Tabaristan, just south of the Caspian Sea. This was one of the new metropolitan provinces that Timothy himself created at the aforementioned Synod of 790 or 791. The establishment of this province seems to have been an attempt to reinforce the Christian presence in a fundamental node of the road to Turkestan in China, because it was located along the Silk Road. Before heading further north and east, we should mention another metropolitan province established by Timothy to the west, that of Damascus. Eliot of Damascus, writing more than a century after Timothy came to the patriarchal throne, mentions 5 dioceses under this metropolitanate: Aleppo, Jerusalem, Mabuk or Manbij, Mopsuestia, and finally Tarsus and Melatene or Malatia in modern-day Turkey. So this province stretched from Palestine in the south, north through Syria, and into Cilicia or Cilicia in Asia Minor. Frederick Norris makes the point that the presence of the Church of the East in this area was made possible because, quote, the Byzantine laws against them were no longer in force following the Muslim conquest, end quote. In other words, after the Arabs conquered much of the former Byzantine territory in places like Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Cyprus, there were no more restrictions placed on, quote, the Nestorians, as the Byzantines referred to them, to keep them from establishing churches in those areas. Nevertheless, the Church of the East never held a monopoly in these territories around the Mediterranean due to the fact that Syrian Orthodox and Melkites were the demographic majority. Another province established by Timothy in the traditional territory of other Christians was Aran, or Little Armenia, located in what's now modern Azerbaijan between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. Despite the area being a center for Armenian Christianity, the Church of the East was able, as Wilmhurst says, quote, to win a precarious foothold there, end quote. We don't really know if the Church of the East was in the process of trying to convert pagans to Christianity, or possibly trying to win over Armenian Christians to the Church of the East. It's unclear. And finally, before heading east on the Silk Road, there's a curious example of Dailam and Gilan, located along the southwest coast of the Caspian Sea. This mixture of coastal plains and mountainous territory was host to inhabitants, mostly Zoroastrians or pagans, who regularly raided south into Persian territory or later on Arab territory. As Thomas of, one behind. There we go. As Thomas of Marga's Book of Governors tells us, in 780, Timothy commissioned a team of monks from the monastery of Beth Abe, led by Shuba Lisho, to evangelize Dailam. Timothy consecrated Shuba Lisho as the first metropolitan of Dailam and Gilan, but he was subsequently killed by local inhabitants of his new jurisdiction. So Timothy then consecrated two new metropolitans in his place, Kardag for Gilan and Yabalaha for Dailam. As a side note, we might note Timothy's innovative way for getting around the canonical requirement that 3 bishops must be present to ordain another bishop, a requirement that would be difficult in a remote province like Dailam and Gilan. In a letter to the Metropolitan Yabalaha, he wrote, quote, "Inasmuch as the ordination of a bishop does not absolutely require the presence of 3 persons, and you and your country are free from this regulation, you have permission to do so by the power of the word of our Lord, in which everything stands and is directed. Appoint as bishops whomever you and the pious Kardag shall choose, and in the place of the 3rd person who should be present, let the book of the Gospels be laid on the episcopal throne on the right hand. Thus, by the hand of God, perform the ordination of the 1st bishop, and let others be appointed by means of this 3rd person." So Timothy was being a little bit innovative there in his directions to these bishops. Unfortunately, we have little more information about this metropolitanate, except to note that Metropolitan Joseph of the Dailamites and the Galanians was present at the consecration of Yohanan IV as Patriarch in the year 900. This mission to Dailam and Gilan seems to have included the diocese of Mukhan, to be discussed below, which was apparently as far north as the Church of the East reached in the Caucasus. We come now to the Asian network of metropolitan provinces in existence along the Silk Road during Timothy's patriarchate. I'll spend a bit more time on these since this is the subject matter I am most familiar with. I'd like to highlight here 2 important aspects of the eastward expansion of the Church of the East under Timothy. The first concerns our sources of information on the mission of the Church of the East, and there's already been a number of references to this. But the crucial role played by Timothy's letters, again, out of the total 200 written, we have about 59 which are still extant. And these letters, in the words of Sidney Griffith, can often be considered as, quote, perhaps best thought of as essays destined for a wider Christian readership, end quote. As Bertie notes, given the great distance between the Patriarch in Baghdad and the metropolitans scattered across the Asian continent, quote, it became crucial that the Patriarch made his own image as sovereign of the Church credible by the only means at his disposal, the letter, end quote. Letters were thus of vital importance in administering a church spread out over such a wide geographic territory. And before moving on, we should also remember the over 140 letters of Timothy that are now lost to us. We'll likely never know the information they would have provided us regarding affairs in the many metropolitan provinces spread out along the Silk Road. The second aspect I'd like to bring attention to is the vital role played by the missionary monks who were sent out by the church. Monks who'd been extensively trained in the many famous monasteries of the church in such subjects as scripture, philosophy, theology, medicine, and languages. It's arguable that without the important role that the monastic movement played in the Church of the East at the time, the missionary expansion of the church would have been impossible given the great challenges in spreading the gospel eastward. A classic example is given by Thomas of Marga, who describes the piety of Elia, Bishop of Mukan, located north of Dailam and Gilan, in what is now Azerbaijan. In the words of Berti, Vittorio Berti, a scholar, he was, quote, a simple ascetic, reckless in certain respects, but humble and discreet. Elia entered the cities he passed through to reach his see, without showing off power and wealth, without adorning himself with pontifical vestments or being accompanied by a procession worthy of his rank. On the contrary, he presented himself poor, alone, somehow hanging on to his little gospel book, end quote. To this necessary qualification of humility, we may add the following, again in the words of Vittorio Berti. From Timothy's point of view, the metropolitan had to manifest innate intellectual qualities, virtuous conduct, clear orthodoxy, and a good knowledge of the Scriptures. It is on these foundations that the exercise of humility was understood, along with a wise use of logical and rhetorical means. In short, missionary metropolitans and those that traveled with them needed to possess humility and virtue, accompanied by knowledge of the Bible and theology, as well as the intellectual means to present their message. They also had to be willing to make great sacrifices when embarking on their missionary calling. As Vittorio Berti observes, the trips that had made this evangelistic diffusion possible and which guaranteed the continuity of the institutions were dangerous personal ventures, end quote. Now let's move on and address some of these Silk Road metropolitan provinces going from west to east. So I'm just going to grab it. The first such province we encounter is Herat, located in the area known to the Persians as Khorasan. The city of Herat currently lies about 130 kilometers east of Afghanistan's border with Iran. The Synodicon Orientale informs us that a bishop of Herat was present at the Synod of Dadisho in 424, and by the Synod of Ishoyab I in 585, there was a metropolitan in the city. The 11th century polymath Ibn at-Tayyib confirms that Herat was indeed established as a metropolitan province during the Patriarchate of Ishoyab, although he does not indicate which of the three patriarchs named Ishoyab he means. We can be sure from the Synodicon Orientale that it was Ishoyab I. Saliba ibn Yohannes Asfar al-Asfar also mentions metropolitans of Herat under Timothy's successor Isho Bar Nun, and later on under Mary II. Let's take a little detour here to talk about what the Patriarch Theodosius said about Herat and the other exterior metropolitans scattered along the Silk Road. I'm going to talk about letters here, so I've got an image of a letter. It's nothing to do with the Church of the East. It's actually a letter in Sogdian, but it was passed along the Silk Road and gives you an idea of the sort of frequent use of letters going back and forth along the Silk Road. So Abdishol Barbarika's Nomokanon attributes the following directive to Theodosius. Quote, those other metropolitans of China, India, Persia, the inhabitants of Merv, Syria, the inhabitants of Rai, the inhabitants of Herat, and the inhabitants of Samarkand, let them send letters of agreement to the Patriarch once every 6 years, end quote. In other words, due to their distance from Seleucia Ctesiphon, the metropolitans of Herat and other locations along the Silk Road were not required to regularly attend church synods, but only to submit letters indicating their agreement with the teachings of the church. I should perhaps add what Theodosius says right after that quote. And in those letters, let them declare all the general affairs of their countries that are in need of direction. from all their cities, great and small, must be sent to the patriarch, according to ability and the appointed canons of the fathers, that which is given for the support of the patriarchal house. And he who has transgressed these things, the synod has commanded that he be deserving of rebuke from within the synod. Are you taking notes, Marawa? More will be said on the matter of these exterior metropolitans below. Returning to Herat, we should also note that it was likely the most easterly place where competition emerged between the Church of the East and the Syrian Orthodox Church, which appointed a bishop of Herat under the first Maphrian of that church, Marutha of Tagrid, as we learn from Bara Broyle's Ecclesiastical Chronicle. We know that Timothy himself was concerned about this situation in Herat, urging in letter 25, written to Sergius of Elam, who we've heard about, that a young logician be made a metropolitan of Herat in order to do battle with, quote, the Severians, as Timothy called the Syrian Orthodox. Interesting evidence of the Church of the East in Herat has also come to light in a processional cross, which you can see in the image, inscribed in Middle Persian, which mentions the Church of Herat and gives a date that probably corresponds to the year 739 or 749, when Timothy himself would have been a young boy or a young man. About a century later, around 849-850, Ishodna of Basra's Book of Chastity mentions the monastery of Zarnuka in the neighborhood of Herat. This is not long after Timothy's death in 823, so we can safely assume that it was in existence when he was patriarch, and perhaps monks from Herat went eastward in the same way that the monks of Beth Abbeh had gone northward. Elia of Damascus, writing in the early 10th century, includes Herat, Merv, and Samarkand in his list of metropolitans in the Church of the East. Even later, the Muslim geographer Ibn Halqal, writing in 988, tells us of a church just north of Herat, long after the Islamization of the region had taken place. Despite its location in an increasingly Muslim area, Herat would go on to be mentioned as a metropolitan province of the church well into the Mongol era. Another important city in Khorasan, which played a key role in the eastward expansion of the church, was Merv. The city's ruins are now located in southern Turkmenistan. Merv was a very strategic city which functioned as a major political center under the Achaemenids, Parthians, Sasanians, Arabs, Ghaznavids, Seljuks, Khwarazm Shahs, and Timurids. Like Herat, a bishop of Merv, Like Herat, a bishop of Merv first appears in the Synodicon Orientalia at the 424 Synod of Dadisho. But the city received a metropolitan earlier than Herat. Although not physically present at the Synod of Joseph in 554, he sent a letter of adherence to that synod. However, it's possible that there was at least a bishop of Merv, if not a metropolitan, as early as the Patriarchate of Isaac I in the early 5th century, as suggested by both Abdishur Barbarika and Ibn at-Tayyib. The bishop of Merv, present at the Synod of 424, was named Barshaba. He is likely the inspiration for an account of the Christianization of Merv, which we have in Syriac, Sogdian, which is a language to be discussed below, a Middle Iranian language, and Christian Arabic. In this work, the saint who brought Christianity to Merv has the same name, Barshaba, hence it's called the legend of Mar Barshaba. The Syriac and Sogdian versions of this legend were found amongst the Christian manuscript fragments uncovered at Turfan in Chinese Turkestan over a century ago. The saint is also commemorated in a manuscript of the Hudra found at Turfan, which is not extant in any other copies of the Hudra that have come down to us. However, not all metropolitans of Merv are remembered so fondly. David of Merv consecrated Elisha, one of two rival patriarchs, in 524 during a time of schism in the Church of the East, and Timothy's leadership was challenged by Joseph of Merv at the time, during Timothy's patriarchate at the beginning, before the latter, Joseph of Merv, subsequently converted to Islam and was ultimately exiled. An example of the missionary ethos of the church Merv is presented in a fascinating story about Elia, the metropolitan of that city, during the patriarchate of Ishliab II. According to the Syriac Khuzestan Chronicle, probably written between 660 and 680, Elia was responsible for the conversion and baptism of a minor Turkic ruler and his army sometime around the year 644. Elia accomplished this feat in the context of a spiritual battle with priests, perhaps Turkic, perhaps Sogdian, we don't know, who practiced weather magic. As a result, the text tells us that, quote, he made disciples of many people from the Turks and from other peoples, end quote. The aforementioned Book of Chastity by Ishodna of Basra mentions several monasteries of the Church of the East in the vicinity of Merv. Again, given the date of writing, we can assume that these would have been in existence during Timothy's patriarchate several decades earlier. And again, they were probably a source of the monastic manpower needed to continue the eastward missionary expansion of the church. Around the same time, about the year 850, we hear of Ishodad of Merv, one of the greatest biblical interpreters that the Church of the East has ever produced, even though he went on to become the Bishop of Hadatha in northern Iraq. He was always known as Ishodad of Merv. It's likely that Timothy's encouragement of learning in the Church of the East just a few decades earlier played an important role in Ishodad becoming the exegete that he was. Although Ishodad is the only interpreter of scripture from Merv whose works have come down to us, we know of others from that city whose works are no longer extant, including Theodore of Merv, who lived around the year 540, and Elia of Merv, who we've already talked about, who lived around the year 660. Interestingly, we have no records of the Syrian Orthodox being present in Merv, but the Muslim polymath El-Biruni, writing around the year 1000, does mention a Melkite, and as we've talked about already, you've heard already, those are Syriac-speaking Greek Orthodox, a Melkite metropolitan in Merv. We have no idea whether this community had been established as early as Timothy's time, though. As with Herat, Merv continued for some time as a significant metropolitan province in the life of the Church of the East, and its metropolitans functioned as an important conduit of information to the Central Church, such as when Abdishol of Merv passed on a report of 200,000 nomadic Central Asian Turks converting to Christianity in the year 1007 or 1008. We come now to Samarkand, located in ancient Sogdiana, now modern Uzbekistan, long an important city in Central Asia going back to the time of Alexander the Great. Lying as it does on the edge of the Iranian world, it's where the Persian-speaking and Turkic-speaking worlds mingle with each other like the confluence of two great rivers. It's unclear exactly when Samarkand became a metropolitan province, or even whether it was initially the seat of a bishop before being elevated to metropolitan status. It's possible that it was considered so important that it bypassed being the seat of a bishop and was given a metropolitan from the beginning. Unfortunately, we have no record of a metropolitan of Samarkand ever participating in any synods of the Church of the East, undoubtedly because the city was so far away, situated more than 2,700 kilometers to the east of Seleucia Ctesiphon, Baghdad. As you will remember, Abdishol Barbarika's Nomakon tells us that the Patriarch Theodosius directed that remote metropolitans, like those in Merv, Herat, and Samarkand, as well as China, India, and Persia, were not required to attend synods, but only to send letters of agreement to the Patriarch once every 6 years. Hence the absence of Samarkand in the synod records we find in the Synodicon Orientale. As to the Patriarch who appointed the first Metropolitan of Samarkand, there are several different options depending on which author you wish to listen to. Abshil Barbarika's Nomakan gives us a number of possibilities, telling us that Herat, Samarkand, and China were all appointed by the Patriarch Saliba Zaha in the 8th century. But then adding that some say these places were established by the Patriarchs Ahai or Shila in the 5th and 6th centuries, respectively. To further complicate things, Ibn at-Tayyib says metropolitans were ordained for Hulwan, Herat, Samarkand, India, and China by simply, quote, Ishoyab. It's statements like this which make historians like me tear out our hair, and you can see I've torn it all out. Since there were, of course, 3 patriarchs with the name Ishoyab, does Ibn at-Tayyib mean Ishoyab the first, Ishoyab the second, or Ishoyab the third? Without going into details, I'm currently writing a paper on this to present at a conference in September. I still have not come to a solid conclusion. Let's just say that Metropolitan First Samarkand was established sometime between the late 6th and mid-7th centuries, before the Arabs conquered the region. They did not initially cross the Oxus River until 673. At the latest, it occurred in the early 8th century under Saliba Zaha, during the Arab conquest of Central Asia, which was not finalized until the mid-8th century. So again, it was either before or during the Arab conquest that we have a metropolitan of Samarkand. From the mid-6th to mid-7th centuries, the local Sogdians, who spoke a now extinct Eastern Middle Iranian language, had come under the rule of the First Turk Empire. Although by the time of Ishoyab III, the Western Turks who had ruled in Sogdiana had been defeated by the Chinese. So the region would probably have been in a state of political turmoil. There are a number of interesting events involving the Church of the East at the time of the 3 patriarchs named Ishoyab, which are perhaps connected with the likely appointment of Samarkand's metropolitan during this period. The first event concerns a report by the Byzantine historian Theophylact Simokata, writing in the late 620s, who mentioned Turks captured by the Persians in the year 591 during the Patriarchate of Ishoyab I. These Turks had, on the advice of Christians, had crosses tattooed on their foreheads while still young in order to ward off the plague. Who these Christians were remains a mystery, but they must have been connected with the Church of the East. Also of significance is the mission of Aluben, dispatched by Ishoyab II, which arrived in China in 635, about which we'll hear more below when we discuss the Church's presence in China. This mission likely passed through Central Asia, and some have even suggested it may have accompanied an embassy from Samarkand that arrived in China that year. Again, we recall the aforementioned conversion and baptism of the minor Turkic ruler and his army by Elia of Merv sometime around the year 644, just before Ishoyab III came to the throne. Although the text is unclear about where it took place, these Turks may have come down from Sogdian territory to the north of Merv. As evidence of the missionary zeal of the church at this time, we should also note letter 21 by Ishoyab III, written in 651, in which he mentions, quote, more than 20 bishops and 2 metropolitans in the east, end quote. Again, we historians are deeply frustrated that Ishoyab does not tell us where those 2 metropolitans were. Was one of them Samarkand? Indeed, what does the east mean here? We don't know. In addition to these historical records, there's also archaeological evidence from Samarkand regarding the spread of Christianity in the area. Thus we have ossuaries, as you can see in the image, stone boxes in which the bones of the deceased were laid, with crosses on them from the 7th or 8th centuries that have been discovered in Samarkand and other Central Asian locations. And what's interesting about these boxes, these ossuaries, is they were used by the Zoroastrians, who were the majority in Sogdiana at this time, to bury their dead. And the Christians obviously followed the same practice of putting the bones into a box, but put a cross on that box to indicate that they were Christians. We also have a large number of coins with crosses on them, dating from the same time period, again the 7th or 8th centuries, that have been found in Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent, and other locations in Sogdiana. These coins strongly suggest that the cities where they were found had Christian rulers before and during the Arab invasion, since only rulers can mint coins. Samarkand is mentioned specifically by Ibn at-Tayyib and the anonymous Liber Patrum in the context of discussing the ordination of bishops. I was looking for a good image, and that's what I found on the internet. The Fiqh al-Nasraniyya of Ibn at-Tayyib tells us that normally, quote, when a metropolitan has ordained a bishop, he, the bishop, takes the letter of credentials or certificate of consecration and presents himself to the patriarch for confirmation, end quote. However, quote, in the case of remote bishoprics such as Merv and Samarkand, personal confirmation is replaced by written authorization, end quote. The Liber Patrum adds the following, quote, permission was granted to those metropolitans who were distant, so that when they ordained bishops, these did not need to be perfected or confirmed by the patriarch, end quote. After which the author gives us the 4 remote metropolitans, Persia, Merv, Samarkand, and Herat. In other words, the metropolitan of Samarkand could appoint bishops without the involvement of the patriarch. So keep that in mind, Marawa, if you ever have a metropolitan of Samarkand. As with Herat and Merv, Samarkand had a long and influential presence as a metropolitan province of the Church of the East. Curiously, although Saliba ibn Yuhanna includes Samarkand in his list of metropolitans in the Asfar al-Asrar, Abdichol Barbarika's order of ecclesiastical judgments does not. There are times when the metropolitan of Samarkand performed important services to the caliphate, such as when we hear from Bara Broyle's Civil Chronicle that the Nestorian metropolitan of Samarkand, as Bara Broyle refers to him, wrote a letter in 1046 or 1047 about invading hordes from the east, which was read out to the caliph in Baghdad. And finally, despite not needing to come to the headquarters of the church on a regular basis if they lived in one of the exterior provinces, the history of Mar Yabalaha tells us of at least one occurrence when that happened, namely when the metropolitan of Samarkand was present at the election of Patriarch Yabalaha in 1281, although perhaps the reason was that he had not yet been dispatched to his metropolitan see.
After listening to such great amount of information about the missionary enterprises of our Church of the East, I believe we deserve now to listen to a hymn written by Timotheus himself, which is called Raza Dansa, by our sister Gina Kina. Gina Kina always has been involved in all our activities of our church. She decorated our church gathering, our worship services with her angelic voice. And now let us all relax and listen to the angelic voice of our sister Gina Kina. Pardon.
إقارة جورا لقالقت بياشن كيتا لحوقت سبيشالي مشموية الأدخى من هارتا أدخى دزوتا لتلي خبرت مصير ودنا إكسبرس قد أدخلت لان بابواتي جورا وميقرة وجبارة قد خمي رئيسها هالإديو إقارة جورا قانيلة ومالت إقبل إن قد أنا إن خمن هدامت أدخلتها هاشكيرا شمت مريا على إلى خمي وقالن هالإديو جرما الزمرة كمات مصير كز ميوزك لتسن من الإديو بخيت أنا مرضي خلخي على آخر رازدن سون بهيمان وثا نهو الأنمار الخساي خوبه دموثات عوذا وتعوذا أتون شيخا ملكا پاغراخ و دماغ خسيت وشوقت مومي وخوبه دخلت هاي من بخ أشوال خلان دوغي الياناخ باريسيا نبوغ لوراخ وعم صدري هون دشميانه نسق شوخا أمن وآمن.
I can say to this symposium is the first academic program we ever offered in our diocese. Your patience and your support makes us to think about some more such programs, academic programs, to bring to light the history, theology, and liturgy of our Church of the East. I thank Dr. Maureen for donating $25,000 for this symposium. Thank you so much, and may the Almighty God bless you. At this time, I will ask Dr. Mark to come and continue his second session or second part of his presentation, please.
So we begin this next section with a quotation from Timothy's letter 41 to the monks of the monastery of Marmaram, i.e. the Maronites, written in 792 or 793. And by the way, that image is not from this letter, that's just something I found, a nice Syriac manuscript. Quote, "For behold, in all the lands of Babel, Pars and Athor, in all the eastern lands and amongst Beth Hinduaya, and indeed amongst Beth Sinaiah, amongst Beth Tuptaya, and likewise amongst Beth Turkaya, in all the domains under this patriarchal throne, that one who is this hypostasis, who is from eternity without increase, who is crucified on our behalf, is proclaimed, indeed in different and diverse lands and races and languages, end quote. As we continue our survey of the metropolitan provinces in existence when Timothy was patriarch, we consider the 4 groups from the eastern lands mentioned in the letter above: the Indians, the Chinese, the Turks, and the Tibetans. Interestingly, Timothy's comment here is actually in the context of a broader discussion of the wording of the Trisagion, the ancient hymn that repeats the words, "Holy God, holy and mighty, holy immortal one, have mercy upon us." However, despite the subject being a discussion of the Trisagion, I think it's no mere afterthought on Timothy's part that he gives a list of the nations that were, quote, under this patriarchal throne, end quote. The Maronites, who lived in northern Syria, what is now Lebanon, had experienced frequent persecution from the Syrian Orthodox, prompting them to ask Timothy to intervene on their behalf before the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Letter 41 is Timothy's attempt to convince the Maronites to join themselves doctrinally and ecclesiastically to the Church of the East. An attempt that was ultimately unsuccessful, but nonetheless a reminder of the many ways that Timothy worked on expanding the influence of his church. Even though Timothy's reference to the broad geographical extent of the Church of the East comes across as a throwaway comment in the context of the theological discussion, it seems that Timothy was intent on asserting his patriarchal authority in clear terms here. Without directly saying so, he was reminding the Maronites they would do well to join themselves to a truly international church that encompassed such a large collection of different ethnic groups, both those living in the Caliphate and those living far beyond its borders. As Vittorio Berti observes, the success of missionary expansion therefore represented in the eyes of Timothy an important sign of the strength and vitality of his own religious community. Finally, we should note the following observation of Berti. Note the order in which the 4 peoples are mentioned. It seems to imply a sort of circular round-trip trajectory, which appears to favor arriving in China by sea via India rather than the more northern Silk Road. We can suggest that after having reached southern China by sea, the envoys of the Patriarch were able to join the communities of central China, then the Tibetan, and finally the Turkish communities to the west. So let's head south, veering off the Silk Road network for a while to consider the first of the 4 groups that Timothy mentions here, the Indians. Much has been written concerning Syriac Christianity in India, but I'll try to keep my remarks brief and just give a summary of the important points up to the time of Timothy. The ultimate origins of Christianity in India cannot be known with certainty, but traditions amongst the St. Thomas Christians, as Christians in Kerala and elsewhere in southern India are often called, unanimously credit the Apostle Thomas with converting and baptizing the first Indian Christians. I will leave aside the complicated matter of whether or not Thomas actually established the faith in India for now. That could easily be the subject of a whole talk by itself, and it's frankly beyond my expertise. Interestingly, other traditions recorded by the Christian writers Eusebius and Jerome credit the evangelization of India to the Apostle Bartholomew. Some scholars think this may refer to an early mission, perhaps in the 2nd century, from Alexandria, Egypt. Others claim that the India referred to is in fact South Arabia, i.e. Yemen, since there's frequent confusion in ancient literature over the use of the term India. What we can say for sure is that Roman land and sea trade routes linked the eastern Mediterranean to South India, so there was plenty of opportunity for Christian merchants and missionaries to travel. And here you can see a map which gives an indication of some of the land, but especially the sea trade routes that link the Mediterranean with India. In the early centuries of Christianity, there was intense competition between the Roman and Persian empires over commerce with India, but the Persians were gradually able to assert themselves and gain control over the prosperous trade routes. We can see a parallel trend in ecclesiastical matters with the Persian church, the Church of the East, as it was often referred to because it was the church of the Sasanian Persian Empire, gradually gaining control over existing Christian communities that had been established in India. Thus, Cosmas Indicopleustes, a Greek merchant from Alexandria who traveled to India in the early 6th century, noted that the Christian communities on the Indian mainland and various islands, including Socotra, were overseen by bishops appointed from Persia. Although the liturgy would have been recited in Syriac by this time, it also seems that Middle Persian was an important language in the Indian church, not surprising given its connection with the Fars. Thus we read in the Chronicle of Sayert that Mana, the metropolitan of Fars in Revardashar, translated certain liturgical texts from Syriac into Middle Persian in the early 6th century, after which he sent them, quote, to the maritime lands, meaning the Persian Gulf, and India, end quote. More interesting evidence for connections of the Church of the East with India can be found in copper plates from Kollam, which is located on the very close to the southern tip of India, datable to 849 and granting permission for the establishment of a Christian settlement. The use on these plates of the Persian word tarsa, meaning Christian, literally one who fears, strongly suggests that this lay merchant community was Persian speaking. However, as recorded by local Christian tradition, this community of Persian-speaking lay merchants were not without clergy. They brought two bishops with distinctly Persian names, Mar Shapur and Mar Farhad. Further indications of a Persian connection is evident in 9 stone crosses, 8 in the Indian states of Tamil Nadu, Goa, and Kerala, and 1 in Sri Lanka. A number of these crosses have inscriptions in Middle Persian written in the Pahlavi script. Behind these strong links between Persian Christianity and Indian Christianity lay the ongoing efforts of the Metropolitan of Fars at Revardashar to ensure that India came under his authority rather than that of the Patriarch of Seleucia, Ctesiphon. And we've already heard some reference to that. There was pushback from Seleucia Ctesiphon, especially from the Patriarch Ishuia III. By the time of Timothy, it appears from his letter to the monks of Marmaron that Beth Hinduaya was back under the patriarchal throne, i.e. India was no longer under the authority of the Metropolitan of Fars, but was fully submitted to Seleucia Ctesiphon, or Baghdad. And of course there's a reference in Barabroio's Ecclesiastical Chronicle, which has already been read out, so I will not repeat that. And Barabroio's observation is strengthened by what Ibn at-Tayyib tells us, where we read, "As for distant countries like China and India, until the days of Timothy, because of the difficulty of the routes, the bishops used to gather and ordain a metropolitan for them. And because of riots that broke out, and because some rebelled against these sees since the days of Mar Timothy, this rule was only up to his time." Thus, although Timothy made it possible for bishops to be ordained by the metropolitan of the province, he reserved for the patriarch the exclusive right to appoint those metropolitans, not surprising given his experience with the metropolitans of Merv and Fars. This changed state of affairs with the patriarch solidly in authority is reinforced by the quotation that I gave earlier from the patriarch Theodosius, who listed the metropolitan of India amongst those who needed to send letters of agreement to the patriarch once every 6 years. India continues to be an important part of the Syriac world, of course. Indeed, it's the only part of a once vast stretch of Asia where the Church of the East was present, which has continued to have churches that use Syriac liturgies to this day. And even though the Church of the East no longer makes up the demographic majority amongst St. Thomas Christians, thanks in large part to the damage wreaked by the Portuguese, beginning in the year 1500. There's no doubt that for the majority of the history of Christianity in India, your church played a key role that cannot be emphasized too much. Moving back north, and then along the Silk Road network as far east as it goes, we come to China, ruled by the Tang Dynasty at the time of Timothy. As Hidemi Takahashi, the scholar Hidemi Takahashi observes, quote, there have been two main periods in which Christians using Syriac as their liturgical language were present in significant numbers in the traditionally Han Chinese areas of China, under the rule of the Tang Dynasty and then under the rule of the Mongols. We will concentrate, of course, here on the Tang Dynasty at the time of Timothy. However, it seems that evangelization of the Chinese people themselves was never particularly successful, with most Christians during the Tang period being of Iranian background, speaking either Middle Persian or Sogdian. As with India, there are stories of Thomas bringing the gospel to China, but there's no clear historical evidence to support these claims, so we'll put that idea aside for now. As a reminder of what was noted above concerning Samarkand, two patriarchal names are credited with establishing China as a metropolitan province: Saliba Zaha or Ishoyab, as we mentioned already. Again, this could refer to Ishoyab the first, the second, or the third. We can remove Ishoyab the first as a possibility, since his patriarchate was before the initial mission of the Church of the East to China, which is commemorated on the famous Xi'an stele, which you can see in the image and which we'll discuss momentarily. We can also probably discount Ishoyab II because the Xi'an stele describes how the missionary Aluben, who was sent eastward by the church, we'll talk about him more later, received a title equivalent to Syriac Mar during the reign of the Chinese Emperor Gaozong, whose reign overlaps with the patriarchate of Ishoyab III. In other words, it was probably during the time of Ishoyab III that a metropolitan was established in China. However, Ishoyab II is also important to our story, since he was actually the patriarch who dispatched the mission to China. The story is recorded on the Xi'an stele, which was discovered in 1625 after having been buried in the ground for nearly 8 centuries. So let's talk about this bilingual Chinese and Syriac stele from Xi'an, the western capital of the Tang Dynasty, which has a Chinese title that can be translated as, quote, Monument on the Propagation of the Religion of Light of Da Qin in China, end quote. It was erected in 781 at the beginning of Timothy's patriarchate. Interestingly, rather than mentioning Timothy, the Syriac text on the stele says it was erected, quote, in the days of the father of fathers Mar Hananasho, Catholicos patriarch. Had word of the death of Hananasho and the election of Timothy not reached the Christian community in China, located over 10,000 kilometers by road from Baghdad? Or was it due to questions about the legitimacy of Timothy's election? Or was it perhaps because Timothy had been made Catholicos with the backing of the Caliphate, and thus allied with the enemy according to those who erected this monument? We don't really know. As for the content of the stele, as Takahashi notes, it contains an exposition of the teachings of Jing Zhao and an account of its history in China since the arrival of Aluben in 635. Two Chinese terms need some explanation here. And there you can see some of the Syriac text from the monument. First is Jing Zhao. This is a Chinese word used by Christians during the Tang era for their faith, often translated in English as the religion of light, or the luminous religion, or the brilliant teaching. Second, the Chinese name Aluben, referring to the monk who was leader of the mission sent by Ishoyab II to China. It's been open to many interpretations over the years, but it probably represents a transliteration into China of the Persian name Artaban. Indeed, Christianity in China during this period had a distinct Persian connection. It was initially referred to by those outside the community as Bosi Jiao, the Persian religion. But this was changed by an imperial decree of 745 to Da Qin Jiao, with Da Qin roughly equivalent to the eastern part of the Roman Empire, including Palestine and Syria, both of crucial importance, of course, to early Christianity. The Persian influence on Christianity in Tang China can also be seen in the names of some of the monks in the in the community that raised the stele. There you can see some of the monks' names. In addition to common Syriac names like Abdisho, Adam, Elia, Ephraim, Gabriel, Gavargas, Ishak, Musha, Sargis, and Yohanan, to mention only a few, the Syriac inscriptions on the monument also include distinctly Persian names like Mahdad Gushnasp, Mashihadad, Izad Spas, and Gigoy, along with Yazbozid, the patron responsible for erecting the stele, whose father was a priest from Balkh, now in northern Afghanistan. The Xi'an stele is not the only Christian text from Tang China. We're also fortunate to have an octagonal pillar dating from 814 or 815, which was found in Luoyang, the eastern capital of Tang China. The pillar contains a Chinese Christian text entitled Da Qin Jing Jiao Xuanyuan Zhiben Jing, which can be translated as Book of Proclamation of the Highest Origin of Origins, as well as a note which describes the pillar's origins in a Christian community that was obviously Sogdian. In addition to these two stone monuments, there are also half a dozen Chinese Christian texts on paper, referred to collectively as the Jingjiao documents or the Dunhuang documents because they came from Dunhuang. Time does not permit us to discuss these today, other than to mention that one of them, Sanwei Mengdu Zan, translated as Hymn in Adoration of the Holy Trinity, is a Chinese translation of the hymn Glory in Excelsis Deo, or in Syriac what you know as Teshbolta de Malake, suggesting that at least some of the liturgy was sung by Tang-era Christians in Chinese. The century and a half between the arrival of Aloben's mission in 635 and the erection of the stele and beginning of Timothy's patriarchate in 781 was a very tumultuous time, but I'm going to skip over the details for now due to time constraints. Suffice it to say, as one historian has called it, the 7th century was a time of world crisis, thanks to the Arab conquest of the Middle East, along with the westward expansion of Tang China, and the movement of the Tibetan Empire, about which we'll have more to say, into Central Asia. These events came to a head in 751 at the Battle of Talas, on the border between modern-day Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where the Abbasid Caliphate and the Tibetans fought together against and defeated their mutual foe, the Chinese. This was followed soon after by the An Lushan Rebellion, a civil war that rocked Tang China. Now, what is the significance of all these dates and events, you might ask? Here's what I think. The initial mission of the Church of the East to China was sent off in an environment that was politically and religiously chaotic. But the church, your church, did not shy away from that mission despite the difficulties that had taken place and would continue to take place as a result of the Arab conquest of the Persian Empire. Things were not only chaotic in the homeland of the church, they are also turbulent in China, the goal of the church's mission. Nevertheless, neither Timothy nor the church that he led shrank back from this challenge. The patriarch must have felt strongly about the need to continue the mission of the Church of the East to China that had begun nearly 2 centuries earlier when his predecessor Ishuyat II sent Aloben on his mission. Timothy was certainly aware of the fact that Christians in China looked to him as their spiritual leader and shepherd. We see his missionary concern for China in his letter 13, written to Sergius of Elam sometime between 795 and 798, when he says, quote, Many monks have crossed the seas to Beth Hinduaya and Beth Sinaya with only a staff and a bag, end quote. A reminder of the crucial role that monastics played in the mission of the church at this time, particularly in India and China. Timothy also mentions in letter 13 the death of the Metropolitan of Beth Sinaya. His successor is likely referred to by Thomas of Margot when he mentions, in a list of monks from the monastery of Beth Abbey, who were appointed as bishops, metropolitans, or patriarchs, a certain David who was, quote, elected to be Metropolitan of Beth Sinaya. Now I've learned concerning this man from the epistles of Mark Timothy, end quote. Timothy thus seems to have sent someone to China that he knew about and presumably thought highly of, someone worth mentioning in his letters. All this is clear evidence that Timothy was knowledgeable about the state of the church in China while he was patriarch, and took steps to ensure its pastoral oversight was maintained as long as he sat on the patriarchal throne. Just over 2 centuries after Timothy's death, in 845, the Chinese emperor, who was a devout follower of Taoism, issued an official edict banning foreign religions. Although the main target of this official pronouncement was Buddhism, smaller religions that were considered foreign, such as Christianity, Manichaeism, and Zoroastrianism, were also included in the ban. This was essentially the end of Christianity in China during the Tang Dynasty. Although it's interesting that around this time, in 840, the Uyghur Empire was overthrown, and the Uyghurs scattered to several locations to the south, including Turfan, on the northern edge of the Tarim Basin. It's possible that the Chinese imperial edict of 845, which forced Buddhist, Manichaean, Zoroastrian, and Christian monasteries in China to close, and monastics to return to secular life, was a catalyst for some Christians, probably mostly Sogdians, to move to the multicultural and religiously diverse Uyghur state in Turfan, but that's another story. We come now to the metropolitan province of the Turks. As noted in the earlier quote from Timothy's letter 41 to the monks of Marmaram, one of the territories under the patriarchal throne, as Timothy phrased it, was Beth Turkaya, the land of the Turks, sometimes referred to as Turkestan. Further on in that letter, we read the following, quote, "For behold, even in our days, prior to these 10 years that I've been entrusted with the service of the administration of the church, for even now I've been 13 years more or less in this service, the king of the Turkaya, with more or less all of his territory, has left the godless error from antiquity, for he has become acquainted with Christianity by the operation of the great power of the Messiah, that by which all are subject to him. And he has asked us in his writings about how he might appoint a metropolitan for the territory of his kingdom. This also we have done through God. And also the letter that we wrote to him we will send to you if it is pleasing to our Lord." We can add here a tantalizing line from Timothy's letter 47 to Sergius of Ilam, written sometime between 795 and 798, in which he says, quote, "The Spirit has anointed in these days a metropolitan for Beth Turkaya, and we are also preparing to anoint another one for Beth Tuktaya, the Tibetans." I've written extensively elsewhere about this metropolitanate established by Timothy. You can find it on academia.edu. If you're interested, you can contact me and I'll be happy to send it to you. Timothy's reference to the conversion of the Turkic ruler and his people is a bit unclear in the letter, but it seems to have taken place 10 years prior to the writing of the letter, sometime probably in 782 or 783. The Kitab al-Majdal claims that Timothy himself, quote, led the Khacham, king of the Turks, end quote, into the faith. But Timothy says nothing about this in his letter, and we have no indication that the two ever met, unless this conversion took place through the correspondence between the two. Speaking of correspondence, letter 41 indicates at least one letter from the Turkic ruler to Timothy, and at least one letter that Timothy wrote back to the ruler. In fact, the plural term, his writings, suggests that there was more than just 1 or 2 letters between the two. Perhaps, as in the aforementioned conversion and baptism of a minor Turkic ruler by Elia of Merv, this conversion also was facilitated by someone in the church hierarchy, located closer to the Turks, or by members of the merchant community that traded along the Silk Road. We'll likely never know. I'm going to just skip over a reference to the merchants here, but here you can see just an indication of what the Turks would have looked like at this time in the 7th, 8th, or 9th century. The main thing I want to say about merchants, without going through the whole quote I was going to give, is that in order for a church to be a missional church, like the Church of the East, it required not only a missional patriarch, like Timothy, but also missional members, whether monks or merchants. And there's a good argument to be made that merchants played as important a role in the propagation of Christianity along the Silk Road as the monks did. But who were these Turks who were converted to Christianity in the late 8th century? I won't bore you with all the details, but if you read my article, you'll see that the most likely candidates are the Karluk Turks, a group between the mid-6th and mid-8th centuries had been part of the Turk Empire and the Uyghur Empire. In the year 766, they defeated another Turkic group known as the Turgesh and established their own state in what's known as the Ili River Basin, modern-day Kazakhstan, and Sogdiana, modern-day Uzbekistan. In deference to the most senior ruler in the Turkic world, the Kagan of the Uyghur Empire, the Karluk ruler initially adopted the lower title Yabgu, but later on, when the Uyghur Empire collapsed, the Karluk Yabgu seems to have inherited the title of Kagan, i.e. he was considered the most senior ruler in the Turkic world at that time. There you can see an artist's impression of what these Turks would have looked like when they were on the move. Narshaki's History of Bukhara, written in the mid-10th century, tells us that in Muharram AH 280, equivalent to the year 893, the Samanid Amir Ismail, the Samanids were a Persian-speaking dynasty, Muslim dynasty based in Bukhara. Amir Ismail went to fight Taraz, where he experienced great difficulty. Finally, the Amir of Taraz came out with many Dikhans, landed gentry, and accepted Islam. Taraz was thus subjugated. A large church was transformed into a grand mosque, and the khutbah was read in the name of the commander of the faithful, Mu'tadid Billah. End quote. Another Muslim historian, Masudi, writing in the 10th century, tells us that the Turks were the Kharlukhiyya, the Arabic name for Karluk. The fact that the church was large enough to be transformed into a grand mosque suggests that it was probably a cathedral, the residence of at least a bishop, if not a metropolitan. If so, then the metropolitan of Beth Turkaya presumably had his seat in Taraz, located on the steppe in what is now southern Kazakhstan, and there was a metropolitan located there for a full century between 792, when Timothy wrote to the monks of Marmaron, and 893, when the Samanid forces captured Taraz and converted the church into a mosque. Although it's tempting to think of these Turks as primarily people who practice what anthropologists refer to as pastoral nomadism, in other words, traveling around with flocks and herds, the fact that there was a church building in Taraz that was converted to a mosque should make us realize that we're dealing here with a culture that had a significant urban element as well. It's thus not surprising that there's archaeological evidence of Christian buildings, possibly from Timothy's time, in what is now northern Kyrgyzstan and southern Kazakhstan, the heart of former Karluk territory. 2 churches have been partially excavated in Ba'akbeshem, in modern Kyrgyzstan. At least one, and possibly both, can be dated to the 8th century, i.e. around the time when this metropolitan province was established for the Turks. In Taraz itself, various Christian artifacts have been discovered, including a Syriac inscription mentioning Peter and Gabriel, ossuaries, those stone boxes for putting bones in with crosses on them, a clay vessel fragment with a cross on it, and a building which is being identified as a church. It has also been suggested that 3 silver plates of Central Asian origin with biblical scenes datable to the 8th century were fashioned in the Christian Karluk domains as part of, quote, a fascinating narrative of the ways the Christians living amidst Lake Balkhash utilized their religion as a legitimizing force for the newly established Karluk state, end quote. There's an interesting epilogue to the story of these Christian Turks. Scholars think that the Karluks were the group who later established the Karakhanid dynasty with one of its capitals in Kashgar, now located in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in western China. The Karakhanids were important players in Central Asian history from about 955, when their ruler converted to Islam, up to 1137, when they were defeated by another Central Asian dynasty. If Timotheus' Turkaya were the Karluks, who then ruled a Christian state for over a century, this may help explain the later record of metropolitans of the Church of the East in Kashgar during the patriarchates of Barsama and Elia, both in the 12th century. In other words, perhaps the memory of the Christian past of the ruling Karakhanid dynasty provided an environment favorable for the Church of the East to appoint a metropolitan for Kashgar. The scholar Peter Golden suggests that the link between the former Christian Karluk state and the future Muslim Karakhanid state may have been quite direct. Quote, Ismail Samani's Karluk opponent at Taraz may have been Ogulchak Qadar Khan, son of Bilga Kul Qadar Khan. This defeat was perhaps responsible for his withdrawal to the Kashgar region. It was there that a Karakhanid prince converted to Islam. The earlier presence of Christianity amongst the Karluks may also explain the fact that it's precisely on their territory, in the modern Kyrgyz cities of Tokmak and Burana, that hundreds of Christian gravestones dated from the 13th and 14th centuries were found in the 1880s. But again, that is another story. Finally, we should note 2 references from the Mongol era that mention a metropolitan related to the Turks. Abdishal Barbarika's Order of Ecclesiastical Judgments lists the metropolitans of the exterior by rank in the early 13th century, including, quote, 4th, that of the Turkaya. Saliba ibn Yuhanna, writing shortly afterwards, also lists the metropolitans of the Church of the East in his time, giving the metropolitan of Turkestan a rank of 19th overall. Although neither writer specifies the location of this metropolitan, the seat must have been located somewhere in either western Turkestan or eastern Turkestan. Like many other things related to the history of Christianity in Central Asia, this issue requires further research to determine the facts. I'm going to skip through the information about Tibet, as interesting as it is, because I know that we're getting short on time. I just want to go right to the conclusion. But there is definitely evidence for the presence of Christianity in Tibet. If any of you have questions about that later, I'll be happy to address that. So, let me repeat here the 2 brief references. Sorry, that's the wrong section. Okay, so there's no question that the Church of the East at the time of Timothy covered far more geographic territory than did either Latin-speaking Catholicism in Western Europe or Greek-speaking Orthodoxy in Eastern Europe. And you can see a map of what was happening in Europe at the time with the Byzantine Empire and the Kingdom of the Franks. By contrast, we can look at the territory that the Church of the East covered in Asia and the Middle East. Vittorio Berti says, travel was difficult. so communications between the outlying dioceses and the Patriarchal See in Baghdad became tricky. Unlike much of Europe, the vast distances encountered in journeying across Asia involved many dangerous situations, some of the highest mountains and harshest deserts on the globe. This would have made it incredibly hard for the Patriarch in Baghdad to stay in touch with the network of ecclesiastical provinces spread across the Asian continent. Despite the problems of lists of metropolitans by different authors which do not agree with each other, it is certainly the case that the Church of the East was spread out over a vast part of the world. And here we should note a key difference between the Church of the East and Christianity in Europe at the time, where the faith was tightly bound to the state in both the Byzantine Empire and the Carolingian Empire founded by Charlemagne. By contrast, the Church of the East was not a state religion. Under both the Persian Sasanian Empire and then the Abbasid Caliphate, it was a minority religion, which nonetheless wielded significant influence all along the Silk Road, from the great cities of Herat, Merv, and Samarkand to the eastern states of the Turks, Chinese, Tibetans, and Indians. In short, it was no small feat that the Church had metropolitans in two of the great empires of the time, the Abbasid Caliphate and Tang China, with the possible addition of the Tibetan Empire. It was only in the Byzantine Empire and the Carolingian Empire that the Church of the East had no presence. In other words, the Church of the East at this time was a truly international, intercultural church that was not limited to one cultural group or one part of the world. It is true that Syriac It is true, of course, that Syriac was the primary liturgical language used in worship by members of the church, no matter where they lived. But at the same time, the church was open to various texts, including the Bible, or hymns like the Gloria in Excelsis Deo being translated into local languages. In contrast to some churches, which have insisted on the exclusive use of the language of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, such as Latin or Greek, the Church of the East seems to have understood that the gospel is most effectively preached when it is communicated in the language of the hearers. These are the true marks of a missional church, and it seems to have been part of the DNA, if I can use that term, of the Church of the East from early on. It was there centuries before Timothy came along, and will continue on for centuries after he died. However, at the same time, although Timothy was not responsible for this missionary impulse in the church, he obviously considered it an important part of his calling as the spiritual leader of the Church of the East to promote that ethos of mission. Rather than just letting things happen, Timothy seems to have gone out of his way to make them happen, using his position to expand the reach of the church wherever he could, as evident by the number of new metropolitan provinces he created during his patriarchate. In short, and to get back to my title, Timothy was a missional patriarch leading a missional church. Thanks to his concern with education, Timothy was able to send out well-educated missionaries to work in the far-flung regions where the church was found. Thanks to his interest in translation, there seems to have been a genuine openness in Timothy's era to making scriptures and other texts available in the languages of those they were attempting to reach. Thanks to his concern with ecclesiastical law, Timothy took special care to ensure that the church was well served by the hierarchy of bishops and metropolitans, paying particular attention to issues related to the ordination of clergy. Thanks to his concern for maintaining good relations with the Muslim rulers, Timothy was unhindered by the Abbasid state in his efforts to evangelize in regions to the east, as long as he was not actively proselytizing Muslims. Thanks to his recognition of the importance of letter writing, Timothy was able to maintain contact with those involved in the mission of the church elsewhere, as well as reminding those he corresponded with closer to home about what was going on further away. Thanks to his strong relations with monasteries such as that of Beth Abbey, Timothy was able to mobilize monks for the mission of the church, including those who served as bishops and metropolitans outside of the homeland of the church. I hope that this overview of the efforts of Timothy to inject new vision and energy into the mission of the Church of the East has encouraged and inspired you Perhaps some of you here today will be amongst those who will continue the work done by your ancestors in years past. I suspect His Holiness would not object at all if you did. Thank you very much.
It's 2:24 now, so I will give you 10 to 15 minutes for remarks, observations, and questions. I will ask the first one, Professor Robert Brennan, to come and present his observation or remarks. Yes.
Well, thank you for all these excellent presentations. I was here a few months ago, if you might remember, and talked a little bit about this. I'm just going to, everybody's getting a little tired. I'm just going to keep this very, very, very brief. We've heard some incredible history, and certainly Bishop Timothy is one of my heroes. For many years, I lived in the places that he and the Church of the East evangelized. I lived in southeast Turkey. I lived in Kurdistan, Iraq, which is Mesopotamia. I've lived in Central Asia, the Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, those areas. And I've seen the Chinese Rite in Xi'an, China, and visited some other places as well as in India. At that time, I was an evangelical missionary, and my goal was to evangelize Muslims. So I had very little use for the national church because I felt they weren't interested in that. When I say national church, I mean Orthodox, Catholic, Church of the East, and so on. When I got to the Middle East, God did a number on me and really changed my heart. And I began to seek out the early church, the church that I had written off as not evangelistic, not trying to reach Muslims. And I began to reach out to them and had a wonderful fellowship with them. And while I was still interested in reaching, and I could tell you some pretty powerful conversion stories of people that have seen Muslims come to faith in Christ. What I want to leave you today is just the incredible work that God is doing in the very lands that the Church of the East evangelized. I don't know if you're aware of this, but of course we know, you probably have all heard about China, that they thought the church was destroyed. Now there's maybe up to 100 million believers in China. I'm sure most of you have heard that. You may not be as aware of the fact that even the most conservative estimates, the most conservative, that there's at least 100,000 Muslims that have come to faith in Christ in Iran, and probably more likely 1 million or even more. And these are, every one of those people, and I've heard so many of their conversion stories, have an incredible story of faith that have come. How much of that was sown by the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church of the East? What God is doing now. Can I, the book I just had, can I get this from you just for a second? Some of you may have got this last time I was here, but I just want to mention that the reason I'm showing you this is not trying to sell books. I don't have any left. I only have a couple left to sell, so I'm not trying to sell books now. But in this, I mentioned that there are 15 people groups mentioned in the book of Acts. In the second chapter, the Holy Spirit was outpoured. Out of those, 12 are now Muslim. And so they're Mesopotamia, Egypt, 3 of them are in Iran. The Kurds, of course, are the Medes of the Old Testament. The 5 of those places are in Turkey, all Muslim now. And so the tragedy is how all that happened. How could these lands of the Bible become Muslim? But then, at the end, why is it in our day that we're starting to see the first real turning to Christ in those areas? Which is such a remarkable thing that we can all have a part in. And so for example, in Turkey, which has not responded as well to the gospel as certainly as in Iran, but they're still, when I first got to Turkey in 1980, 82 I think it was, you could probably count on one hand the number of Muslims that ever come to faith in Christ. It's probably about 50. Now it's in the thousands. And the Kurds, there was no Kurdish believers when we first went to Mesopotamia in Iraq. Just there recently, and there are churches now open. Now, thank God for the church still existing in Ankara, the Church of the East. A lot of you have probably been visited there. I loved it there. But also, if you get out in the villages and you get out in the small towns, you'll see Kurdish believers. And you'll see them in other parts of that world too. So I really believe with all my heart, I believe with all my heart that God, in His sovereignty and His great mercy, He heard those prayers of Bishop Timothy and the early believers. I think it goes way back to St. Thomas, actually, the Apostle Thomas, and right up through, and I won't go into all the history now, right up through. And although no church has suffered by more martyrdoms than the Church of the East has. The amount of martyrdoms that this church has suffered is in the millions. It's incredible how many martyrdoms, under the Muslims and under the Tamerlane and under all these oppressions that they faced. and yet the work goes on. And so I believe you can be very, very proud. If I was I could be very proud to be part of the Church of the East. Amen? And I mean, it's just an honor, as it was before when I was here, and now it's a great, great honor for me to be here. I feel it's one of the highlights of my 40-plus years of ministry in the Middle East to be a part of this. And just say, I love the Church of the East. And I thank you so much for the great heritage you gave us. Thank you.
هنا قتلتهم سقيدة ومبسملوهم بدنا همزبات قد بيشلوهم زمة بغزاي خطرة وقباروتا وهي معنوتا خيلانتا تأباحاتها قد ينخيشة مشخدة ومنطية شردة برقانة قملات دخينة قد سنيقة من كل يطيل لها مزمن البرقانة طالما منتا من كل how to basim kulo kasharekto. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for their presentations. We have sure learned very much from the valuable information shared through your hard work and dedication. Today, we were all able to expand upon our knowledge of Timotheus the Great, thanks to His Holiness Mar Awa III, Catholicos Patriarch, His Grace Emmanuel, and Professors Mark Dickens. I am sure that we were not able to cover the vast treasury of knowledge of Timotheus the Great, as there are graduate level university courses that spanned entire semesters on Timotheus and his dialogue with Caliph Al-Mahdi the Abbasid. The great teachings that were presented today are examples of person of Timotheus and his positive contributions to the world. With that being said, I call upon His Holiness Mar Awa III Catholicos Patriarchs as the Supreme Primate and Head of the Holy Synod of the Assyrian Church of the East to bless the process of beatification or not canonization as a saint in our Holy Church, who truly made great contributions to not only to the expansion and recognition of the Church of the East. Last but not least, I would like to thank His Holiness Mar Awa, His Grace Mar Awa III, His Grace Mar Emmanuel, Professor Mark Dickens for accepting our invitation and presenting to us today. Finally, I would like to thank Core Bishop George Thoma, our sister in Christ Julie Kako, and all priests of our diocese, the various Mercedes Parish and Assyrian Community Center Committee, and the diocesan media team for their support in making this event possible. Thank you all for attending the first symposium hosted by the Assyrian Church of the East Diocese of the Eastern United States. Without all of your support to the youth have not been possible. I am hopeful that we will be able to continue to host such symposiums in our diocese, as there are many fathers of the Church like Timotheus that deserve to be recognized in dedicated conferences and symposiums to honor their memory and legacy. حابب بسيم رب كلهم بخير تعالها مطلب الدين أخ برونة إيتا أخ بسكوبة أخ شماشة خدمتك بداها الدوم دي قد أوهاتت إيتا كل إنا ينكخوا بالبصانة إنا مرتي ما تسيله أو كخوا بيش بالبصانة قد خزيله ونشميله قخوب قهيمانوته ققيلته قبوتيمانوته قبوتماره مارن إيشا بشيخة بخير تعالها تخط شامت قد يشوف مر بادرير شامخ قد Timotheus ويا طوانا يان في شقرية قديشة قد دخرانة فايشتويدا قهما شكويدا هل كم بسيم كلهم تنبتن كلهم قد شريك لهم ولهم أمر إن إيتن باصوريات البخلطة بطلابه جاي قامة اللي قد السيمبوزيوم بدالة بالبعدوغ إنا من نسيانا بتلاقي بردانات خيل سبب رابعة واحد إتلن رابع خار إتلن رابع من ديانا إتلاقاها إيتاقا شاروك أمخيني قد ليبر جانو دودية ومال بختخيني كيلو هناك تباسي وطنان بيتر قد يشوف بطريقة بسلوط شوليالة أها سيمبوزيوم وطلوهم قد يشوف قد بسلوط خاتم له وكلهم تقديتهم جو آبانا كوتر حاضرين قد شاركيهم جو من خلطة مريم بارك لكم بس مرابا
شنا ومنور خوش الله مين طيبوث مراني شمشيخة وخبد على هآوة وشو تاقوث دروخت خدشة تيوم كلن عاشوا وخل الزمان والعالم امين